Welcome back to Step by Step Completing the Square Part 2. Now, I'm going to complete the square on 3 quadratic equations. Here's the first one. X squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 0. First thing you want to do is make sure you align the equation this way. The x squared term, the x term, the constant, the equals, and the 0. So the first thing we want to do is we want to subtract 15 on both sides. Okay, and that gives you x squared plus 8x. I'm going to leave a blank space right here, equals negative 15. So that's the first step. Second step is to take this 8 and divide by 2. And then square it. We're always going to divide by 2, and we're always going to square it. Now, when we do that, 8 divided by 2, it's going to give me 4. And I write it in red because we're going to use it pretty soon. And then 4 squared gives me 16. Now this 16 that I just created, I'm going to pop it here on the left. And I'm going to add 16. Whatever you do on the left, you're going to have to do it on the right. So if I add 16 here, I'm going to have to add 16 there. Now, you'll notice here on the left that this is a perfect square trinomial. You can factor this if you want to, or if you want, it has this general form. Perfect square trinomials have this general form. You just have to pop in something that's in here, where we have it, which is this 4. How convenient. This 4 goes right here. So we're going to add 4. It's a plus 4. And then we have an equal sign. Negative 15 plus 16 gives you 1. Okay, the next thing is we got to get rid of this square. To do that, we need to take the square root on both sides. Again, whatever we do on one side, we got to do on the other. So we're going to take the square root on both sides. This will take care of the square on the left. When we take the square root of 1, it is 1, but because we're dealing with quadratic equations, we're going to need 2 answers. Usually there are 2 roots. So I'm going to put a plus minus. This will help me remember that I have 2 equations. The first one is x plus 4 equals 1. And the other one is x plus 4 equals negative 1. The negative 1 comes from here, this negative here, and then the plus 1 comes from over here. So we get 2 answers. The next thing we want to do is we want to subtract 4 on both sides. X equals negative 3. And here we want to subtract negative 4 on both sides. We get x equals negative 5. We get 2 separate answers and 2 roots. Now, the reason why I chose this problem to start off with was twofold. One is that the coefficient here is 1. When the coefficient here is 1, the problem tends to be kind of easy to do. And to make it even more easier is that this middle term, this 8, is an even term, because that middle term we're going to divide by 2. So those 2 things make this problem very easy. Now let's do the next problem. Okay, now let's do the next quadratic equation. This one, a, is less than 1. And the first thing we want to do is make sure it's aligned correctly. We got the quadratic term, the linear term, the constant. And so we move the constant over. In this case, we're going to add 15 on both sides. Negative x squared plus 8x equals 15. And we leave a space right here. Now, you'll notice that the quadratic and the linear term look very similar to what we were doing in the other problem. But this time, we just can't take 8 and divide by 2 and square it, because when we do that, we won't be able to get a perfect square trinomial. And so one thing we should do is we should factor a negative out. Now some of you might say, well, why can't we just divide by a -1 and then just, finish it off? You could do that, but the thing is, I want to keep this negative because when we do the graphing, you'll see that we're going to be using this negative to help us determine how the graph looks for the parabola. So I'm going to keep it. It might be a couple of extra steps, but it's well worth it. Okay, so when I take out a negative from this, I'm going to have an x squared here, and negative times x squared is negative x squared. Negative times something gives me 8x. Well, that's going to be a negative 8x. It's blank here. And we have the 15 over here on the right. Okay, now we can take the -8 over here, and we're going to divide by 2 and then square it, just like we did before. We divide by 2 and then we square it. Now when we do that, -8 divided by 2, we get a -4 this time. And -4 squared is going to be 16. Now I'm going to add 16 over here on the left. I'm going to add 16 here. Now you might be tempted to say, well, I'm going to add 16 over here. Well, remember, we're in this environment in here, inside the parentheses. If you look overall, the overall picture, we didn't add 16, we added -16. Because negative times 16 is 16. Overall, we added a -16. Okay, now we know that this is a perfect square trinomial. So it has this form here. The negative is just coming along for the ride. Right here, 15 take away 16 is going to be -1. Now this -4 goes in here, or you can just factor this if you wanted to, but that's the advantage of writing it over here instead of doing mentally. You can see that this -4 goes in there. Okay, then the next step is, you might say, well, we can't take the square root. I guess we're done. We can't do anything. Well, that's not right. What we can do is we can get rid of this negative by multiplying by a -1 on both sides. I prefer to divide by -1 on both sides. So here it is, -1 on both sides. And I get x take away 4 square equals 2 negatives make a positive, and that's going to be a 1. Okay, so now we can take the square root on both sides. Take the square root of both sides, and we get x minus 4 equals square root of 1 is 1. But because we're dealing with quadratics, we need two answers, two roots. So x minus 4 equals 1. X minus 4 equals -1. The plus 1 comes over here. The -1 comes from down here. And the stuff on the left is always the same. So I'm going to solve for x. I'm going to add 4. X equals 5. I'm going to add 4 on both sides. X equals 3. And there we are. We get two answers. So in this case, the a was a negative number, and we had to factor it out. And the reason why we factored instead of dividing is we want to keep that negative as long as we can, so that when we graph, it's going to help us in the graphing process. And so this one also, great thing about the middle term was that it was even, it was nicely done over here on the right, and we kept on going, and we get two answers. Now let's do the next part. Okay, So we need to complete the square on this trinomial, okay, this quadratic equation. So we got the quadratic term is fine, the linear term, the constant, the equal sign, the zero, everything's lined up, ready to go. So what I need to do is I need to add 15 on both sides. So I can have the quadratic and the linear by themselves, blank equals 15. Okay, we're going to have to factor this 2 out. So I can create the perfect square trinomial. And another reason why I want to factor out the 2 is so I can graph. But if your teacher is not graphing and is not doing this step, some teachers will just divide by 2. Okay, so when I factor out a 2, I have x squared here, because 2 times x squared will give me 2x squared. 2 times something will give me negative 7x. The trick here is, because this one's odd, and 2 doesn't go into an odd number very nicely, so what we do is, I need a negative, because 2 times something will give me a negative 7x, so I'm going to need that negative. And we make a fraction. We need a 7, and then we're going to put the 2 here. The denominator is whatever's outside here, because you can cancel these 2's, and you're going to be left with the 7. And then I need an x here. Now, there's nothing here that we need to do on the right. Okay. All right, so we need to take negative 7 over 2 and divide that by 2, and then we need to square it. Even though it already has a 2 in the bottom, you might say, well, it already has a 2 in the bottom, but no, we still need to divide by 2, and we still need to square it. So this is really negative 7 over 2 divided by, this division bar tells me, 2 square, which is really negative 7 over 2 times, what do we do with this 2? Well, we take the reciprocal, right? And then we do the math. I'm going to change colors here. Negative 7 times 1 is negative 7, divided by 2 times 2 is 4. I'm going to use that so I can do my perfect square trinomial. And negative 7 over 4 times negative 7 over 4 gives me, well, what's negative times negative is positive. 7 times 7 is 49 over 16. So all that work, 2x squared minus 7 over 2x plus 49 over 16, close it, equals 15 plus, not 49 over 16, because 49 over 16 is in here. But if you look overall, that 2 belongs to that 49 over 16. So if you look over here, let's see, 49 over 16 times 2 over 1, that's 49 times 2, which is 18, 8, 9, 98. So that's really 98 over 16 times 1 is 16. Okay, we're going to visit that in a little while. So that's really 98 over 16. Okay. So we can now, this is a perfect square trinomial, so it has this form right here. We're going to deal with that in a little while here, but I'm going to pop in negative 7 over 4. That's where this goes, so we don't have to worry about that. It's just popping it in. And 15 plus 98 over 16. Okay, well, let's go back to this. So that's 98 over 16 plus 15. Well, I'm going to put a 1. If you have a calculator, it's going to be, of course, much easier. But we're going to try to do this in our paper here. So we need a denominator of 16. Oh, let's see, 15 times 16, that's 30. 6, 7, 8, 9. X, that's a 5. And then the 1, 0, 4, carry the 1, 240. Okay. So that's 98 over 16 plus 240 over 16. And they both have the same denominators. So I'm going to add a 98 to this. That's going to be 8, and that's going to be 13. So that's 338. So 98 plus 240 is 338 over 16. Okay. So that's going to be 338 over 16. Okay. Looks pretty good. And then we got to get rid of this 2. So we could multiply by half on both sides. I prefer to divide by 2 and divide by 2. So this is going to be x minus 7 over 4 square equals 338 divided by 16 divided by 2. Wow. Let's go over here. We'll do it over here. 338 over 16 divided by 2. That's 338. And we'll put a little wall here. Over 16 divided by 2. This division is really that. That 2 is here. That's 338 divided by 16 times half, because we take the reciprocal. So that's 338 divided by 32. 338 times 1 is 338. And 16 times 2 is 32. So let's go over here. So this is really 338 divided by 32. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to have a new sheet here. Let's paste it here. There we go. Okay, like if it's the same page. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, if I take the square root here, it's going to be a little bit hard to take the square root of 32 and the square root of 338, especially when I don't have a calculator. But I bet you I can reduce 338 and 32 by 2. So if I reduce it, and it's just a trick, because I know where this problem is going. If you had a calculator, it'll be easier. But if I reduce, it'll give me 169 over 16. And 169, you can't take the square root of that. So now, let's take the square root on both sides. Okay. And take the square root of 169 divided by 16. All right. So now we know that this is going to be x minus 7 over 4 equals the square root of 169 is 13. And we know the square root of 16 is 4. And because we're dealing with quadratics, we need to say plus or minus right here. We have 2 roots, 2 answers. So x minus 7 over 4 equals 13 over 4. And x minus 7 over 4 equals negative 13 over 4. So we get 2 answers. And we come over here, we add 7 over 4. We add 7 over 4. We get x equals 13 plus 7 is 20 over 4, which is 5. We're going to add 7 over 4. We're going to add 7 over 4 on both sides. We get x equals negative 13 plus 7 is going to be what? Negative 6 over 4. But we can reduce to negative 3 over 2. correct? And now we have two answers. You have x equals 5 and x equals negative 3 over 2. So this problem has a lot of steps, many steps. It started off looking like this, and we had to move over the constant. We had to factor, and the whole idea of factoring is so that we can graph, but we could have divided by 2 if we wanted to. And then when we did that, we noticed that we had to reduce so that when we take the square root, if we didn't have a calculator, but if we didn't have the calculator, it would have come out to be fine. And then there's two answers, two roots, and we had to solve for x, and that's what we did. We had two answers for our problem here, two roots. So that's how you do the trinomials in completing the square.